It was a Saturday morning at the most popular diner in Ashford Falls, and every table was full. Without warning, a young woman grabbed a man by the collar of his worn work jacket and hauled him out of his seat. She told him his dirty boots and labor clothes were ruining the image of her family's restaurant, and she wanted him on the sidewalk where he belonged. Dozens of people watched. Nobody moved. The woman laughed, certain that this town, every corner of it, answered to her family. She had no idea who the man actually was, and that ignorance was about to cost her everything. Ashford Falls was the kind of town that looked like money without trying to hide it. The main street ran clean and wide, lined with iron lampposts and flower boxes that somebody paid good money to maintain. The storefronts had been renovated twice in the last decade, and the residents who'd lived there long enough remembered when the whole place looked ordinary. That was before the Whitmore family decided to turn it into something else. The Whitmores owned more of Ashford Falls than most people realized. They had the diner on the corner of Maple and Fifth, the 2 office buildings on the east side, and 3 residential properties that they rented out at rates nobody questioned out loud. The family name was on the donor wall at the community center and on the sponsorship banner at every local event worth attending. In Ashford Falls, the Whitmore name wasn't just respected, it was structural. It held things up, and everyone knew it, and the people who lived there had learned over the years that the easiest way to get along was to treat that fact as simply the weather-present permanent not worth arguing with. Savannah Whitmore had grown up understanding exactly what that name meant. She was 29 years old, and she carried herself with the specific confidence of someone who had never been told no in a way that stuck. She was striking in appearance, dark hair, careful makeup clothes that were quietly expensive, and she moved through spaces as though they had been arranged for her convenience. She ran the day-to-day operations of the family's restaurant group, which meant she made decisions about staff atmosphere and clientele, with the authority of someone who considered those things deeply personal. The diner on Maple and Fifth was her flagship. She walked through it on weekend mornings, like a property manager doing an inspection, and the staff moved accordingly. They had all learned, some of them the hard way, that Savannah's standards were not suggestions, and that her displeasure arrived quickly and without much warning. That Saturday started like any other. The diner was full by 8 in the morning, the way it always was on weekends. The smell of coffee and griddle grease hung warm in the air. Every booth was taken, and the counter stools were occupied by regulars who'd been coming in for years. The servers moved fast and kept their expressions neutral the way experienced staff do when they know the owner is in the building. Ryan Carter had been coming to this diner on Saturday mornings for the better part of 2 years. He always took the same booth near the window, the one with a slight wobble in the table that the staff had never quite gotten around to fixing. He came alone, ordered black coffee, and whatever the breakfast special was, and spent the better part of an hour eating without looking at his phone. It was the one quiet ritual he allowed himself before the rest of the weekend caught up with him. The servers knew his order. A few of them knew his name. He tipped well and never caused trouble, which in a diner like this made him nearly invisible in the best possible way. He was 35, broad-shouldered, with the kind of build that came from actual physical work rather than a gym membership. His hands were rough at the knuckles, and there was a faint grease line under 2 of his fingernails that he hadn't fully gotten out from the job the day before. He was wearing a gray canvas work jacket over a plain shirt, and his boots had dried mud on the soles from a site he'd been at Friday afternoon. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who worked hard with his hands, who was taking an hour for himself before the day started, and who had absolutely no interest in being noticed by anyone. Savannah spotted him from across the room before she'd even made it to the hostess stand. She had just come through the front door, still wearing her sunglasses, scanning the dining room the way she always did, checking table arrangements, staff posture, the general aesthetic that she worked hard to maintain. The diner had been refurbished 18 months ago. New upholstery, new light fixtures, a cleaner menu layout. She had pushed for all of it because she believed the restaurant's image reflected directly on the family. Ashford Falls had money, and the people with that money expected to sit somewhere that matched their self-perception. Ryan Carter did not match that image. That was the first thought she had when she saw him. The work jacket, the boots, the posture of someone who was completely unbothered by his surroundings. It registered to her as a kind of intrusion. Not a threatening one. Just an aesthetic problem, the way a scuff on a clean floor is a problem. She took her sunglasses off and walked toward his booth. Ryan was reading the back of the laminated menu, even though he'd had the same order for 2 years. It was something to do with his hands while the coffee settled. He didn't notice Savannah until her shadow crossed the table, and by then, she was already standing directly beside him, with her arms crossed and her expression set into something between displeasure and authority. "I need you to take your meal to go," she said. Her voice was even. She wasn't yelling. She had the particular control of someone who had delivered uncomfortable instructions many times before and expected compliance. "Or finish up quickly and move on. This section is for a reservation." Ryan looked up at her. He glanced around the room briefly at the empty tables in his immediate vicinity, at the lack of any reservation marker anywhere near his booth, and then looked back at her. "I just got my coffee," he said. "I haven't ordered yet." "I understand that," Savannah said, "but I need this space. You're welcome to eat at the counter." Ryan set the menu down. He wasn't angry. His voice stayed flat and polite. "I've been sitting here for about 10 minutes. If there's a reservation for this booth, someone should have mentioned it when I sat down. Your staff seated me here." He said it without challenge, just as a statement of fact. He reached for his coffee cup. Savannah's expression shifted. It was small, a tightening around the eyes, but it was visible to anyone watching closely, and several people in the nearest booths were watching closely. What she had expected was for him to apologize and move. Men who looked like Ryan Carter in her experience did not push back. They accommodated because accommodation was easier than whatever came next. The fact that he hadn't apologized, that he'd responded with something reasonable and calm, read to her as defiance. "The staff made a mistake seating you there," she said, her voice dropping lower, now not quieter, but heavier. "I'm correcting it. You can move to the counter, or you can take your order to go. Those are your options." With respect, Ryan said, "I'm a paying customer. I'd like to finish my breakfast." There were 6 or 7 people within earshot who heard that exchange clearly. One of them, a woman in her 50s, sitting 2 booths down, looked down at her plate. A man near the counter pretended to check his phone. The servers who had seen Savannah do this before found reasons to be somewhere else in the room. Nobody intervened. In Ashford Falls, intervening against a Whitmore was the kind of decision that followed you home. Savannah uncrossed her arms. "This is my restaurant," she said. "My family's restaurant. That means I decide who sits where and how long they stay. And right now, I'm deciding that you're in the wrong seat." She leaned forward slightly, just enough to make the power differential visible to anyone watching. "Do you understand?" Ryan looked at her for a moment. Not with anger, with something quieter than that. "I understand that you own this place," he said. "I also understand that I haven't done anything wrong." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand up. He just sat there with his coffee and held his ground, the way someone does when they've decided that backing down would cost them something they're not willing to spend. That was when Savannah reached down, took hold of the collar of his work jacket with both hands, and pulled. It wasn't a violent motion. It was worse than that. It was deliberate. She pulled him up from the booth with the practiced ease of someone who had learned that physical action, when performed with enough confidence, looks like authority rather than aggression. Ryan, caught completely off guard, stumbled to his feet. His coffee tipped. The cup hit the edge of the table and cracked against the floor. She walked him to the door. Not ran, not shoved, walked. One hand still gripping the back of his jacket, steering him past the counter and past the hostess stand, through the front door and out onto the sidewalk. The entire diner watched. No one said a word. Not one person stood up. Not one voice called out. The silence was the kind that settles in a room when everyone present has made the same private calculation and arrived at the same answer. Ryan stood on the pavement in the morning sun, with a damp sleeve from the spilled coffee, and the specific kind of stillness that belongs to a man processing something he did not see coming. He turned and looked back through the glass. Savannah was already straightening her blazer, already scanning the dining room again, already moving on. She pushed open the door and leaned out just enough to be heard clearly. "Don't come back in those clothes," she said, and her voice carried the length of the sidewalk. "We have a standard here." Then she let the door fall shut. The people inside the diner sat in their booths and at their stools and stared at their food. Some of them had their phones out. 2 of them had been recording from the moment Savannah reached for his collar. One of them had caught everything: the conversation, the grip, the walk to the door, the final line through the glass, in a single unbroken shot. They didn't post it immediately. They just held it the way people hold something they don't yet know the weight of. Ryan stood on the sidewalk for a moment without moving. He looked at his hands. He looked down at his boots, at the dried mud on the soles that had apparently caused all of this. Then he walked to where his truck was parked 2 spaces down, an old dark green pickup, dented on the rear quarter panel, with a wooden cargo box secured in the bed. He got in. He sat behind the wheel for a moment, with both hands resting in his lap, staring at the diner's front window. He didn't look angry. That was the thing that would stay with the people who watched him from inside. He looked like a man who had made a decision somewhere in the last 30 seconds and was now simply waiting for the moment to settle before he moved. Inside the diner, Savannah had already returned to her usual walkthrough. She was speaking with one of the servers near the far end of the counter, making a note on her phone about something related to the coffee station setup. The booth near the window, the one with the wobbly table, the one with a cracked coffee mug on the floor and a damp napkin half fallen off the seat, was already being cleared by a busboy who kept his eyes down and worked quickly. The morning was already reorganizing itself around the gap left by what had happened, the way water closes over a stone. A man in his early 40s named Dennis, a regular who always sat at the same counter stool on Saturday mornings, watched the busboy clean up the booth. He looked at the front door, then at the window, then at the parking space where he was standing. The window, then at the parking space where Ryan's truck was still sitting. He had his phone in his hand. He had a contact saved under the name Marcus Webb, an old friend who'd worked in private equity in Boston for the last 15 years. They talked maybe 4 times a year, usually about nothing consequential. Dennis looked at the phone for a long moment, then unlocked it and pulled up Marcus's number. He didn't make the call right away. He waited. He watched the truck at the window, and he thought about what he'd just seen. And he thought about something Marcus had told him at a golf weekend 2 summers ago. A story over drinks, the kind of story that sounds too strange to be true and sticks with you anyway. Because of that. A story about a technology company, about a partnership that almost didn't survive its 2nd year, about a man who had walked away from something that later became worth more than most people could calculate. He thought about that story now. He thought about it carefully, measuring what he remembered against the man sitting in the parking lot in the old green truck. Then he put his coffee down and stepped outside. Savannah, running a hand along the edge of the hostess stand and checking for dust, did not notice him leave. She was already thinking about the afternoon reservation block, about the vendor call she had at noon, about whether the booth cushions in the back section needed replacing before the end of the month. The man with the work jacket and the mud-caked boots was already filed away under a category she kept for minor disruptions, handled closed, forgotten. Outside, Dennis stood on the sidewalk with his phone to his ear. Ryan's truck was still in the parking space. Ryan hadn't moved. Dennis turned slightly so his back was to the window, and when the call connected, he spoke quietly and without much setup. "Marcus," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to tell me if I'm remembering right." Dennis was still on the phone when Savannah came back outside. She hadn't planned to. She'd been halfway through a conversation with her floor manager about the lunch prep schedule when she looked out the front window and noticed Ryan's truck still sitting in the parking space. That bothered her more than she expected it to. She had handled the situation cleanly, efficiently, the way she handled most things. The fact that he was still there, just sitting behind the wheel, not driving away, not making a scene, just sitting, felt like a kind of passive refusal that she found more irritating than an argument would have been. An argument she could answer. Stillness she couldn't. She came through the front door and walked to the edge of the sidewalk. Dennis had his back to her and was speaking quietly into his phone. She didn't register him. Her attention was on the dark green pickup 2 spaces down, on the shape of Ryan through the windshield, on the stillness of a man who apparently had nowhere else to be and no urgency about leaving. Savannah walked to the truck. She knocked on the driver's side window with 2 knuckles sharp and deliberate. Ryan looked at her. He rolled the window down. "You're still here," she said. "I'm parked on a public street," Ryan said. "I'm not blocking anything." Savannah looked past him into the cab of the truck, the way people do when they're looking for something to use. Her eyes moved across the dash, the worn seat, the folded work gloves on the console. Then her gaze shifted to the bed of the truck, where the wooden cargo box was secured with 2 straps. It was a simple box, aged hardwood metal clasps, the kind of thing you'd find in an estate sale or a job site office. It looked old. It looked out of place on a work truck in a way that was just distinct enough to catch her attention and hold it. "What's in the box?" she asked. Ryan looked at her steadily. "Personal items." That answer landed wrong with her, though she couldn't have said exactly why. It was too simple, too unbothered. She walked around the front of the truck to the bed. Ryan got out of the cab, slowly, not rushing, and came around to stand near her. "You don't have permission to touch that," he said. Savannah had already gestured to one of her security staff, a broad man named Carl, who worked weekend mornings at the diner, and had learned that his job description included whatever Savannah decided it included. Carl had followed her out without being asked twice. She nodded at the box, and Carl stepped forward and unclipped the 2 straps. Ryan said, "Don't." He said it once without raising his voice. Carl looked at Savannah. Savannah nodded again. Carl lifted the lid. The box was lined with a layer of dark cloth, and resting on top were 4 or 5 photographs, old ones printed on matte paper, slightly faded at the edges. 2 of them showed 2 men standing in front of what looked like an early office space, the kind with mismatched furniture and whiteboards covered in diagrams. The men in the photos were younger, and one of them was clearly Ryan, same build, same set to the jaw, though the version in the photograph was wearing a button-down shirt instead of a work jacket. Beneath the photographs, a rubber-banded stack of documents, a worn leather notebook, its cover soft with age. And in the corner of the box, wrapped in a square of folded fabric and secured with a single piece of twine, a pocket watch, silver, engraved, clearly old. Savannah reached in and picked up the pocket watch before Ryan could say anything. She turned it over in her hand. On the back, an engraving in small, clean letters, RC. "Keep moving." She looked at it for a moment, then looked at Ryan with an expression that had curdled from irritation into something closer to contempt. "This is what you're protecting," she said. She held it up slightly, displaying it to no one in particular, though 3 people on the sidewalk were now watching. An old watch and some papers. She turned the watch over again, examining it the way someone examines a thing they've already decided has no value. "What's this worth?" $20, 30 Monicant. Ryan's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very still in the way that things go still just before they become permanent. Savannah set the watch down on the edge of the truck bed, not carefully. It tipped off the edge and hit the pavement. The case cracked along one side. Ryan stepped forward and picked it up without looking at her, wrapping it back in the fabric with both hands, his jaw set and his movements deliberate. He placed it back in the box. He closed the lid himself and reclipped the straps. "I want you to leave," he said. His voice was completely level. "And I want your employee to step back." "Or what?" Savannah asked. Ryan didn't answer. He looked at the box for a moment, then looked at her, and the look wasn't threatening. It was the look of a man filing something away. Not forgetting it. Filing it. There was a difference, and anyone watching closely enough could see it. Savannah turned to the small cluster of people who had gathered on the sidewalk to watch. There were 6 of them, maybe 7, a mix of diner patrons who'd stepped outside and passers-by who'd slowed down at the sound of voices. She registered them not as witnesses, but as an audience, and she performed accordingly. She picked up the photographs from the box Carl had left the lid open and held them up briefly before setting them down on the truck bed, with the exaggerated care of someone making a point about how little care they're actually taking. "You want to tell me what a man in work boots is doing, carrying around old photographs and a broken watch on a Saturday morning," she said loudly enough for the sidewalk to hear. Her voice had shifted into something performative and amused. "What exactly is the story here?" She was smiling now, the kind of smile that doesn't involve warmth of any kind. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a lot of nothing." 2 of the people watching laughed. Not hard. Not convincingly, the reflexive laugh of people who align themselves with the most powerful person in the room before they've thought it through. The others stayed quiet. One of them, a younger woman near the edge of the group, was holding her phone at her side, at an angle that suggested she had been recording for the last several minutes. Ryan put the photographs back in the box, closed it again, and walked to the driver's side door. He got in. He didn't slam the door. He didn't peel out. He pulled out of the space with the same unhurried control that had characterized every move he'd made since Savannah first approached his table, and he drove to the far end of the block, where he pulled over and stopped. He didn't drive away. He just moved out of the immediate situation, and that restraint was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. Anger would have been readable. This was something else. Savannah watched the truck for a moment, then took her phone out. She had taken a photo earlier, at some point during the confrontation at the truck bed. She had photographed Ryan standing there with the open box behind him. Work jacket, mud on his boots, expression flat. She looked at the photo now. She typed a caption that described what had happened in a version that was entirely her own. A man who'd refused to leave, who'd caused a scene, who'd turned a quiet Saturday morning into something unpleasant. She added a remark about standards and expectations. She posted it. The post got responses within minutes. Some of them were her regulars, people who followed her, because she represented the Whitmore brand, and who reflexively validated whatever she said. A handful of comments took her side with the enthusiasm of people who enjoy having a target. A few others were quieter people who had questions about the story, or who noted that the man in the photo didn't appear to be doing anything wrong. Savannah dismissed those comments without engaging. She went back inside. Dennis had ended his phone call. He was standing near the corner of the building watching the diner's front entrance. His coffee was cold inside, and he didn't go back for it. He walked to his own car, sat down, and sent a text message. 3 sentences. He sent it to Marcus Webb, and Marcus forwarded it within 10 minutes to someone else. Someone whose name would have meant nothing to anyone in Ashford Falls on that particular Saturday morning, but whose name moved things in certain circles at a speed that most people never got to witness. The kind of name that, when it appeared on a caller ID in the right city, caused people to answer on the first ring, regardless of what else they were doing. Inside the diner, the morning continued. Tables turned over. The brunch crowd came in at 10 and filled the room again. Savannah moved through the floor with her usual efficiency, speaking to staff, checking on a vendor issue in the kitchen, answering 2 phone calls about the reservation system. She didn't think about Ryan Carter again until mid-afternoon, when a second wave of responses began appearing on her post. Responses that had a different tone than the first wave. These weren't from her usual followers. They came from accounts she didn't recognize from people who had apparently seen the post shared somewhere else, or who had found it through a tag or a comment thread. The tone of these responses was harder to dismiss. A few of them asked pointed questions about whether she had physically removed a customer. Someone had apparently shared the post alongside the video, the one taken inside the diner. The unbroken shot of Savannah gripping Ryan's collar and walking him to the door. Savannah hadn't known that video existed until she saw it attached to a share of her own post, and the sensation that passed through her when she watched it was not quite what she expected. She looked different on camera than she had felt in the moment. She had felt controlled, professional, decisive. On camera, she looked like something else entirely, something she didn't have a comfortable word for. She closed the app and put her phone face down on the hostess stand. She told herself it would pass. These things always passed. Someone else's drama would surface by tomorrow, and the algorithm would move on, and Ashford Falls would go back to being the place where the Whitmore name carried the weight it had always carried. She had managed worse than this. She repeated that to herself with the particular insistence of someone who is no longer fully convinced by what they're saying. By early evening, the video had been shared 412 times. By the time the diner closed at 9, it had crossed 3,000. A local news aggregator in the state had picked it up with a headline that used the phrase, "Diner owner physically removes customer." A business journalist in Boston, someone with 60,000 followers, and a specific interest in how power operates in small American towns, had posted it with a single line of commentary that got more engagement than the original video. Savannah's post was still up. Her caption was still visible, sitting directly above the growing avalanche of context that made it look worse with every hour that passed. Ryan had parked his truck on a quieter street 3 blocks from the diner. He had been sitting in the same spot since mid-morning, not because he had nowhere to go, but because he had decided to stay close. The cracked pocket watch was in his jacket pocket, now wrapped in its piece of cloth. He had taken it out twice and held it in his hand without opening it. The engraving on the back, "RC Keep Moving," was still fully legible despite the crack in the case, which had split along the bottom edge and left the face intact. He had put that engraving there himself years ago before giving the watch to Theodore, the day they signed their partnership agreement. It was meant as a kind of private joke between two people who were always behind schedule on everything, and also underneath the joke as something more honest than that. Theodore had given it back to him the day Ryan left the company, the engraving already there, unchanged, which was its own kind of answer. Ryan held it a moment longer than necessary, then put it back in his pocket and looked at the street ahead. His phone had been quiet all morning. It rang once in the early afternoon, a number he recognized, an old one, someone he hadn't spoken to in a long time. He let it ring through. It rang again 20 minutes later. He let that one through too. The third time it rang from the same number, he looked at it for a long moment, and then answered. The voice on the other end was familiar in the way that things from a previous life are familiar, present and distant at the same time. "Ryan," the man said. "I heard what happened. I'm already on the road." Ryan looked out the windshield. A couple walked past on the sidewalk with a dog on a leash. The evening light was going gold across the storefronts. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know I don't," the man said. "That's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because I owe you more than I've ever been able to say in a phone call, and what happened today is not something I'm going to sit in a room and ignore." There was a sound of a car door, an engine, the ambient shift of someone in motion. "I'll be there in the morning." Ryan didn't argue. He said, "All right," and ended the call and sat there for another hour as the evening darkened around the truck and the street outside. The diner stayed lit and busy and completely unaware of what was already in motion. The town of Ashford Falls went to sleep that Saturday night, not knowing that by Sunday morning, everything that had seemed fixed and certain about who held power in that place was about to become a question. Sunday morning came in clear and cold, the kind of early fall morning in Ashford Falls, where the light sits low and flat across the storefronts, and everything looks sharper than it actually is. The diner on Maple and 5th opened at 7:30 as usual. By 8, it was full again, the same weekend rhythm, the same regulars, the same smell of coffee and griddle heat. But the atmosphere was different in a way that was difficult to name precisely. People were talking in lower voices. Phones were out on more tables than usual. The staff moved with the careful efficiency of people who had read the same news that everyone else had read, and were waiting to see what happened next. A server named Gail, who had worked the Saturday morning shift for 3 years and had been one of the people standing near the counter when Savannah walked Ryan to the door, refilled coffee cups, with a steadiness that looked deliberate, like she was holding something in place by keeping her hands busy. Savannah arrived at 8:15. She had not slept well. She had spent part of the night monitoring the spread of the video, telling herself each time she checked that it had peaked, that the numbers had stabilized, that the worst was over. Each time she checked, she was wrong. By midnight, the video had crossed 12,000 shares. By 4 in the morning, a verified account with a significant national following had reposted it with commentary that was brief and precise, and did considerably more damage than a longer piece would have. By the time she got out of bed, it had become the kind of story that local news stations call their digital editors about on a Sunday morning. She came through the front door of the diner with her phone in her hand and her jaw set, and she went directly to her office in the back without stopping to check the floor. Her father had called twice. Her family's attorney had left a voicemail that ran 4 minutes long. 3 of the restaurant group's commercial partners had sent emails that used phrases like "wanted to reach out before the week starts" and hoping to get clarity on the situation. She sat at her desk and read through them in order, and the sensation building in her chest was something she didn't have a clean name for. Not quite fear, not quite anger. Something that lived in the space between the two, where a person starts to understand that a situation has grown past the point where they can manage it by deciding to ignore it. She had managed things by deciding to ignore them many times before. This was something different in a way she was only beginning to measure. Ryan was already outside. He had parked in the same spot on the public street 2 spaces down from the diner entrance, and he was sitting on the tailgate of the truck with his jacket on and his hands in his lap, watching the street the way a man watches something he has no particular investment in controlling. He had been there for 40 minutes. People walking past had recognized him from the video. A few of them slowed down, a few nodded at him. He nodded back without making anything of it. He was waiting, and he was doing it quietly, and the patience in his posture was the patience of someone who had decided to let the morning unfold at its own pace. The convoy arrived at 8:47. 3 vehicles turned onto Maple Street from the north end, 2 black SUVs flanking a dark sedan, moving at the measured speed of a procession rather than traffic. They pulled to the curb directly in front of the diner with the kind of unhurried precision that signals to anyone watching that the people inside are not accustomed to being rushed. The SUVs stayed running. The sedan's rear door opened, and Theodore Grant stepped out. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired, wearing a plain wool overcoat over a dark shirt. No tie, no display. He was not a man who needed costuming to announce himself. His face was the face that appeared on the covers of business magazines and in the background of photographs taken at Senate hearings and industry summits. A face that carried the specific gravity of someone who had spent decades making decisions that moved large amounts of money and had learned to do it without appearing to exert effort. He was one of the wealthiest private citizens in the country. He was also at this moment walking across a sidewalk in Ashford Falls toward a man sitting on the tailgate of a dented green pickup truck, and he was walking the way a man walks when he has somewhere to be and knows exactly where that is. The people on the sidewalk stopped. The couple from the diner who had just stepped outside to leave stopped with their hands on each other's arms. Dennis, who had come back that morning and was standing near the corner with a fresh cup of coffee, went completely still. Gail, who had stepped outside for 30 seconds of air, pressed her back against the diner's exterior wall and did not move. Theodore Grant walked to Ryan Carter and stopped in front of him. He looked at Ryan for a moment, not the look of recognition, but something older than that. Something between two people who know each other at a depth that doesn't require expression. Then Theodore did something that nobody on that sidewalk had anticipated. He inclined his head, a deliberate, unhurried bow, not theatrical, not performed for the crowd, just a clean and honest acknowledgement of respect from one man to another. "Ryan," he said. That was all just the name, and the weight he put into it was the weight of everything that came with it. Ryan looked at him from the tailgate. "You didn't have to drive down here, Theodore." "I told you on the phone why I did," Theodore said. He straightened up and looked at the diner, then back at Ryan. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Ryan said. "The watch has a crack in the case." Theodore's expression shifted slightly, a tightening brief and controlled. "I know. I heard." He looked at the diner entrance for a moment, then back at Ryan. "Then let me say what I came to say." By this point, the sidewalk had filled. People had come out of the diner. Others had stopped on their way past. Someone had already started filming. Theodore turned to face the gathered crowd with the natural ease of a man who had addressed rooms much larger than this and had never needed a microphone to fill them. He spoke clearly and without performance. He said that his name was Theodore Grant, which he acknowledged most people present likely recognized, and he said that he was there because of what had happened the previous morning to a man he owed more to than he could adequately state in a single conversation. He said that Ryan Carter had been his partner, not an employee, not an advisor, but an equal partner in the early years of building the technology company that had become the foundation of everything Theodore had gone on to do. He said that Ryan had been the one who had seen the architecture of the original system clearly when Theodore had been looking at it from the wrong angle, and that, without that correction given freely without condition, at a point when the company had maybe 4 months of runway left, the company would have failed in its second year, and everything that followed would not exist. He said that when Ryan's wife became ill, Ryan had made a decision that Theodore had tried to argue him out of and failed. Ryan had sold his stake in the company back to Theodore at a price that was fair by any reasonable standard, but nowhere near what it would eventually be worth. He had done it cleanly and without resentment to free up his time and his resources completely, to be present without the obligations that came with being a part owner of an enterprise that was just beginning to grow. Theodore said he had tried many times in the years since to find a way to balance what he felt he owed formally through offers and arrangements that Ryan had declined each time with a patience that Theodore had found both admirable and quietly maddening. He said Ryan had told him once that what he'd done wasn't a transaction and didn't need to be treated like one. Theodore said that answer had stayed with him longer than most things people had said to him in a life full of consequential conversations. The sidewalk was silent. Inside the diner, through the front windows, the entire dining room had turned toward the glass. Nobody was eating. Nobody was talking. They were all watching a man in a wool overcoat stand on a public sidewalk and account for a debt that had never been formally recorded anywhere. Theodore said one more thing. He said that the pocket watch that had been dropped on that pavement the previous morning, the one now sitting in Ryan's jacket pocket with a cracked case, had been a gift from Ryan to Theodore on the day they signed their original partnership agreement more than a decade ago. Ryan had put his own initials on it and given it as a way of marking something that mattered. Theodore had given it back to Ryan the day Ryan left the company, with the engraving, "Keep moving," added below the initials, because it was the only honest thing he could think of to say at a moment when saying anything felt insufficient. He said it was the most valuable thing he owned, that couldn't be assigned a number, and that watching it get knocked off a truck bed and left on the pavement by someone who had no idea what it represented was the reason he had gotten in a car and driven through the night. Savannah had come out of the back office when she heard the voices through the walls change in character. She had come through the kitchen and through the swing door behind the counter, and was now standing at the far end of the diner floor, looking out through the front windows. She could see Theodore Grant on the sidewalk. She could see Ryan on the tailgate. She could see the crowd. She could see 4 phones raised at various angles recording everything in real time. She stood there for a long time without moving, and the experience of watching it was something she would not be able to adequately describe later, even to herself. It was not quite humiliation, though. That was part of it. It was something closer to the sensation of a room you thought you understood, revealing a wall you hadn't seen before. Her floor manager, Patricia, a steady woman who had worked for the Whitmore family for 11 years and had seen most things that happened in that building, came to stand beside her. Patricia didn't say anything. She just stood there, which was its own kind of statement. The days that followed were not gentle. The video of Savannah removing Ryan from the diner had been viewed by an audience that now had full context for who he was. The coverage had moved from local aggregators to regional news to 2 national outlets that framed it specifically as a story about class assumption and the reflexive cruelty it produces. Savannah's post, the caption she had written herself, the one describing Ryan as a disruption to standards, was screenshotted and circulated alongside Theodore's account of who Ryan actually was, and the contrast was not survivable in any image management sense. No statement could run fast enough to get ahead of it. 2 of the restaurant group's commercial partners formally suspended their agreements pending review. A third sent a letter that didn't use the word termination, but meant it. A fourth, a regional supplier the Whitmore family had worked with for 6 years, simply did not return the follow-up call. The Whitmore family's attorney advised Savannah's father on Sunday afternoon to move toward a public statement before the week's news cycle locked the narrative into a shape they could no longer influence. Her father called Savannah that evening, and the conversation lasted 45 minutes, and was not the kind of conversation that leaves a person feeling that anything has been resolved. He was not angry in the way she'd expected. He was quiet in a way that was harder to absorb than anger would have been. Savannah issued a public apology on Monday. It was written with the help of a communications consultant her father had retained over the weekend, and it was careful and complete. It named Ryan directly acknowledged that her behavior had been wrong without qualification, and made no attempt to reframe the events or redirect context toward anything else. She posted it on the same account where she had posted her original caption. She did not add anything editorial to it. She just posted it and put her phone down and sat in her office for a long time in a room that felt considerably smaller than it had 72 hours before. Ryan read the apology on his phone while sitting in his truck outside the hardware supply yard where he picked up materials on Monday mornings. He read it once, then set the phone on the passenger seat and sat with it for a while. He didn't share it or comment on it. A reporter from the regional outlet had reached out through a contact, asking if he wanted to respond publicly, and he had declined through the same contact without elaboration. He had nothing to add to what had already been said by someone else on a sidewalk on a Sunday morning, and he saw no reason to extend something that was already finished. Theodore had offered after the crowd dispersed to connect Ryan with 3 separate business opportunities that he believed were suited to what Ryan could do. Ryan had listened carefully to all 3. He had said he'd think about one of them, a consulting arrangement limited in scope, the kind of work that could be done without changing the shape of his daily life in any significant way, and had declined the other 2 with a gratitude that Theodore recognized as genuine rather than polite. They had shaken hands on the sidewalk before Theodore got back in the sedan, and Theodore had looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who wants to say something and has decided that what he's already said is enough. The pocket watch went to a clockmaker in the next town who examined the case carefully and said the crack could be stabilized without affecting the movement. It would leave a visible line along the bottom edge, a seam that hadn't been there before, permanent and clean. Ryan paid the repair bill in cash and picked it up the following Thursday. He held it outside the clockmaker's shop, turning it over, running his thumb along the new seam. It was the same watch. It kept the same time. The damage was visible, but it hadn't broken anything that mattered, and the engraving on the back was as legible as it had ever been. 3 months later, on a Saturday morning in late November, Ryan Carter walked into the diner on Maple and 5th. He was wearing the same kind of clothes he always wore, canvas jacket work pants, boots that had seen better days. He came through the front door at 8 in the morning and went to the booth near the window, the one with the wobbly table that nobody had ever quite gotten around to fixing. Gail brought him coffee without being asked the way she always had. The dining room was full, the same as always. People looked up when he came in. Some of them nodded. A few said, "Good morning." There was nothing performed about it. No ceremony. No self-consciousness. Just the ordinary acknowledgement of a person who belongs in a room and has always belonged there, regardless of what he was wearing. Savannah came in at 8:30. She had been arriving later on Saturday since the fall, doing her walkthroughs after the rush instead of during it. She came through the front door and saw Ryan at the window booth, and she stopped for just a moment before continuing to the hostess stand. She spoke with Patricia briefly about the reservation sheet, then moved through the floor the way she always did, checking tables, checking the service rhythm, doing the work that kept the place running. She did it without performance and without the surveying quality that had once made every staff member in the room aware of her position. When she reached the far end of the floor near the window section, she stopped at Ryan's booth. She didn't sit down. She stood there with her hands at her sides and looked at him, and the look on her face was not the look of someone who had rehearsed what they were about to say. "I meant what I wrote," she said. "The apology. I meant it." Ryan looked up at her. "I know," he said. Savannah nodded once. She looked like she wanted to say something more and had decided somewhere between the hostess stand and this booth that there was nothing more to say that would improve on what had already been said. She moved on down the floor and continued her walkthrough. Ryan turned back to the window. Outside, Maple Street was doing what it always did on Saturday mornings. Slow-moving cars, people on the sidewalk with coffee cups, the iron lampposts, catching the low November light. He ordered the breakfast special when Gail came back around, and he ate it without looking at his phone. And when he was done, he left a tip on the table that was larger than the bill the way he always had, and walked out into the cold morning air. The town of Ashford Falls looked exactly as it always had from the outside. But the people who lived there knew in the way that people know things they've witnessed firsthand and can't unknow afterward, that something had shifted quietly without announcement in their understanding of what a person's worth actually looked like. Not what it was declared to be, not what it wore, what it actually was when you stripped away everything else and paid attention to what remained.